A deaf farmer waded into a raging flood to save a foal everyone else ignored, reading the river by vibration while the crowd screamed warnings he couldn't hear. He reached it as the bank gave way. Then the real shock. The foal's mother, thought drowned, was found alive downstream, shielding a second baby from the debris. His deafness wasn't a weakness. It was the only reason any of them survived. Mark Sutton grew up in a town that never quite knew what to do with him. He lost his hearing at age 7, and for 40 years he was the quiet man on the back roads, the farmer who used his eyes and hands while everyone else used their ears. On the day the flood hit, the McClellan River broke its banks in 17 minutes, sweeping cars and cattle into brown chaos, while a crowd of onlookers gathered at the bridge, phones raised, watching a shivering foal trapped on a shrinking sandbar. They called out warnings, shouted advice, but nobody stepped into the water. Nobody except Mark, who couldn't hear a single word they said. Instead, he felt the river's vibrations through his boots, read the surface patterns like a map, and walked into a current that others were too afraid to face. But to understand what he did that day, you first have to understand what the town had never seen in him. The McClellan River had always been a temperamental thing. For most of the year it ran shallow and clear, a lazy ribbon of green water that farmers used to irrigate their bottomland pastures. But when the spring storms blew down from the mountains, it could turn ugly in minutes. The old-timers in Clayton County knew the signs. A sudden stillness in the air, the way the cattle clustered on high ground, the faint tremor underfoot that meant water was already tearing through the upper canyons. Mark Sutton knew it better than any of them, though he had never heard the roar of a flood in his life. He felt it through the soles of his boots, a low thrumming that traveled up through his bones and told him exactly how fast the river was rising and where the water was headed. He lost his hearing to bacterial meningitis when he was 7 years old. It came on fast, a fever that burned through his small body over 3 terrifying days. And when it broke, the world had gone quiet. His parents, tenant farmers who worked land they didn't own, couldn't afford specialists or fancy interventions. They learned to communicate with their son through gestures and touch, through the careful shaping of words with their hands. Mark adapted, as children do. But adaptation meant learning to read the world in ways that hearing people never bothered with. He noticed how wind moved through dry corn, how a horse's flank twitched before it startled, how water carried messages that sound could only hint at. By the time he turned 18, he could walk into a barn and know within seconds if an animal was sick, simply by the way the air felt against his skin. He couldn't explain it, not really. It was just what he had become. The town of Clayton never quite knew how to categorize him. He wasn't simple, everyone agreed on that. He worked his small farm with a quiet efficiency that put others to shame, repairing his own equipment, birthing his own calves, never asking for help. But he didn't come to church socials or volunteer for the fire department. He didn't stand around the feed store trading gossip. He existed on the periphery, a solitary figure who waved from his truck and kept moving. People assumed he was unfriendly, or perhaps ashamed of his silence. Only a handful of neighbors understood that Mark Sutton had simply built his life around a different kind of input, a different way of being in the world. He wasn't avoiding them. He was just tuned to a frequency they couldn't hear. The morning of the flood started like any other. The forecast had called for rain, but nothing unusual. A spring shower, maybe an inch. By 9 o'clock, the sky to the west had turned a bruised purple, and the first fat drops began to fall. By 10, the rain was coming in sideways, and the creek behind Mark's barn had jumped its banks. He stood on his porch, one hand pressed flat against the wooden pillar, eyes closed. The vibration told him everything. The river, still half a mile away, was already running fast enough to move boulders. He climbed into his truck and headed toward the bridge. What he found when he arrived was a scene frozen in collective paralysis. The McClellan River had transformed into a churning monster, brown and thick with uprooted trees, fence posts, the bloated body of a dead cow spinning in the current. On the far side of the bridge, where the river bent hard around an old gravel bar, a narrow finger of sand still held above the water. And on that sand, no bigger than a kitchen table, stood a foal. It was a filly, maybe 3 months old, her coat a deep chestnut that was already slicked dark with rain. Her legs trembled so violently that she seemed to vibrate in place. The sandbank was collapsing in increments, chunks of earth sloughing into the current every few seconds. Someone later estimated she had perhaps 10 minutes before the river swallowed her completely. A crowd of 20 or 30 people had gathered on the bridge, their phones held out, their faces a mixture of horror and helplessness. They shouted down at the water as if their voices could do what their bodies refused to attempt. They yelled for someone to call the fire department, for someone to get a rope, for anyone to do anything. But no one moved. It wasn't cowardice exactly. The river was genuinely lethal. The current that day was clocked later at 47 miles per hour, fast enough to rip a grown man from his feet and pin him under submerged debris in seconds. The county rescue squad was still 20 minutes out, delayed by washed-out roads. The people on the bridge were farmers and shopkeepers, not swimmers, not heroes. They watched the foal's legs slide closer to the edge, and they filmed, and they felt the sickness of their own inaction settle into their stomachs. Mark parked his truck 100 yards back and walked the rest of the way. He didn't push through the crowd or announce himself. He simply moved to the railing and looked down. The foal was screaming, though Mark couldn't hear it. He could see the flare of her nostrils, the white rim of terror around her eyes, the way her whole body braced against the tremor of earth dissolving beneath her hooves. He dropped to one knee and pressed his palm against the wet concrete of the bridge. The vibration came through, the deep shudder of water tearing at the riverbed, and beneath that, a subtler frequency, the resonant pulse of the sandbank itself, hollow and unstable, already beginning to fail. The crowd was yelling at him now, though he didn't know it. They were telling him to get back, that the rescue squad was coming, that there was nothing anyone could do. A man grabbed his shoulder. Mark turned, saw the man's mouth forming urgent words he couldn't catch, and gently removed the hand. He wasn't being defiant. He simply knew something they didn't. The river was speaking to him in a language he had spent 40 years learning, and it was telling him that if someone didn't act now, that foal would be dead in 6 minutes. He walked to the end of the bridge where the bank sloped down to the water's edge. The current here was waist-deep and moving fast, but not impossibly so. He could see the seam where the main channel veered away from the sandbank, creating an eddy on the downstream side. It was a narrow window, a path of relative calm that his eyes could trace, but that meant nothing to ears filled with the roar of the flood. He stepped down the muddy bank, his boots sinking deep, and heard nothing of the shouts behind him. The only sound he perceived was the thrum through his feet, the steady language of the river telling him where to go and what to avoid. He stepped into the water, and the cold hit him like a fist. The crowd fell silent, not in approval, but in the certain conviction that they were about to watch a man die. But Mark didn't focus on the fear. He focused on the vibration, the subtle shifts in current that warned of a submerged log ahead, the dead spot to his right where the water had scoured out a deep hole. He moved slowly, each step tested before he committed his weight. The foal saw him coming and screamed again, a sound that tore at the hearts of the hearing people on the bridge, but that reached Mark only as a visual plea, a desperate reaching of her muzzle toward him. The sandbank cracked. a chunk the size of a dinner table sliding into the current. The foal stumbled, her hind legs slipping into the water. Mark lunged forward, his arms outstretched, and the river surged. His fingers closed around the foal's halter just as the sandbank dissolved completely. The earth simply vanished, sucked into the current like sugar in hot coffee, and suddenly there was nothing beneath them but water. Mark felt the river grab his legs, felt the wrenching pull of the deep channel trying to drag him under, and he did the only thing his body knew to do. He stopped fighting. He let the current take him, not in surrender, but in the way a man who has spent 4 decades reading rivers understands that panic is a faster killer than any flood. He wrapped one arm around the foal's neck, kept her head above the surface, and angled his body downstream, riding the surge rather than battling it. The crowd on the bridge lost sight of them within seconds. The water was too brown, too churned with debris, and the bend in the river swallowed them whole. People screamed. A woman dropped to her knees. The man who had grabbed Mark's shoulder now stood frozen at the railing, his face ashen, his phone still recording. He would later tell reporters that he was certain he had just watched 2 deaths in real time. The video, shaky and rain blurred, cuts to gray water, and then to nothing. For a long, terrible moment, there was only the roar of the river and the sick certainty of tragedy. But Mark was not dead. 200 yards downstream, where the river widened and the current weakened against a stand of flooded cottonwoods, he found the slack water he had been reading from the bridge. His boots touched bottom, soft mud that sucked at his feet but held. He hauled the foal upward, her legs thrashing, her small body trembling so hard he could feel it in his chest. She was alive, coughing water, her eyes rolling white with terror, but alive. Mark stood there in chest, deep water, holding a 70-pound animal against his soaked chest, and for the first time since stepping off the bridge, he looked back. The sandbank was gone. The bridge was a distant line of tiny figures. He began to walk, slow and deliberate, toward the far bank. Every step was a negotiation with the current, a reading of the river's shifting intentions through the soles of his boots. He didn't slip once. When he emerged from the tree line 40 minutes later, the foal cradled in his arms like an overgrown lamb. The crowd had moved downstream in a frantic search. They spotted him in the gray light, a figure appearing from the mist like something out of an old story, and the sound that rose from them was not a cheer, but a collective exhalation, a release of breath that had been held since the moment the water closed over his head. Martha Camden, who ran the hardware store and had known Mark since childhood, was the first to reach him. She was crying, her words tumbling out too fast for him to read her lips, but he understood anyway. The foal whimpered. Someone threw a blanket over them both. The rescue squad arrived 12 minutes later, their sirens cutting through the rain, and found their services largely unnecessary. The hero had already finished the job. The foal's name, they soon learned, was Penny. She belonged to the Hendricks family, who ran a small breeding operation on the north side of the county. That morning, Ruth Hendricks had been leading her mare, Annie, and her 3-month-old foal across the low-water crossing when the flash flood hit. It came without warning, a wall of brown water that swept the mare off her feet and ripped the lead rope from Ruth's hands. Penny was washed onto the sandbank by a freak eddy. Annie vanished downstream. Ruth stood on the bank, screaming her horses' names, until neighbors pulled her to higher ground. When Mark walked out of the river carrying her foal, Ruth was at the triage tent the paramedics had set up, her face streaked with tears and mud. She held Penny for 15 minutes before she could speak. When she finally did, she asked the question everyone else had been too afraid to voice. "What about Annie?" The mare. Had anyone seen the mare? The assumption was unspoken but universal. A full-grown horse swept into that current stood almost no chance. The river was a mile wide in places, choked with submerged trees and barbed wire and all the deadly detritus that floods collect. Even if the mare had survived the initial surge, the debris would have beaten her to death within minutes. A search was a formality, a kindness for a grieving owner. The rescue squad commander, a pragmatic man named Torres, told Ruth they would send a boat downstream at first light to recover the body. He said it gently, but it was clear he expected to find a corpse. Mark didn't say anything. He was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, a towel draped over his shoulders, watching the river. His eyes were fixed on a point about a quarter-mile downstream where the water churned around a massive debris jam, a tangle of uprooted trees and broken fence posts that had piled against an old railroad trestle. He had noticed it on his walk back, a deep vibration through the ground that didn't match the rhythm of the current. It was irregular, frantic. Something alive was in that water. He stood up and started walking. Torres called after him, but Mark didn't turn around. Ruth saw him moving along the bank, his boots squelching in the mud, and something in his posture made her follow. A handful of others trailed behind, the same instinct that draws crowds to accident scenes pulling them along. Mark reached the debris jam and stopped. He pressed his hand against a fallen cottonwood, feeling the vibrations travel up through the wood. The pattern was unmistakable now. A large animal, exhausted but still fighting, her movements weakening but not yet gone. He turned to the small group that had gathered and began to sign, his hands moving rapidly. Nobody understood. He pointed to the water, mimed a horse's head, and then pointed to his ears and shook his head. "I can't hear her," he was trying to tell them, "but I can feel her." Martha Camden understood first. She had grown up with Mark, had watched him as a boy pressing his palms to fence posts and tractor engines, learning the world through vibration. "He says there's a horse in there," she told Ruth. Alive, Torres, who had jogged over with a pair of bolt cutters, looked skeptical. The debris jam was a solid wall of wood and wire, the water boiling through gaps with enough force to crush anything caught inside. "There's no way," he started. But Ruth was already shouting, already scrambling down the bank toward the edge of the pile. And then she heard it, a whinny, faint and ragged, but unmistakable. Annie was in there. What followed was an extraction that none of the professionals on scene had ever trained for. Mark and Torres worked together, the commander following the deaf farmer's silent directions. Mark would point, indicating where the vibration was strongest, and Torres would cut, his bolt cutters slicing through wire and his chainsaw clearing branches. They worked in a rhythm that transcended words, a partnership born of shared urgency. It took an hour. When the last log was pulled away, what they found stopped every person on that bank cold. Annie was alive. The big chestnut mare was wedged between two cottonwoods, her head barely above water, her body battered and bleeding from a dozen cuts. But she was breathing, her eyes half closed with exhaustion, her legs trembling with the effort of keeping herself upright against the current. And pressed against her flank, shielded from the worst of the debris by her mother's body, was a second foal. This foal was smaller than Penny, a colt with a white blaze on his forehead and the same chestnut coat as his dam. He was maybe 2 weeks old, still wobbly on his legs, and he had no business being alive. The Hendricks family hadn't even known he existed. Ruth stared at the colt with her mouth open, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Annie had foaled twins, rare, almost unheard of, and almost always fatal for one or both. But here they were, both of them. The filly that Mark had pulled from the sandbank and the colt that his mother had somehow kept alive through a mile of raging floodwater. The mare had swum with a newborn pressed to her side, navigating debris and current, and when she became trapped in the jam, she had positioned her body as a shield. She was still doing it, even now, her neck curved protectively around the tiny animal at her flank. Torres radioed for veterinary support. The extraction of Annie and the colt took another 2 hours, requiring slings and sedatives and the careful dismantling of the debris jam around them. Mark stayed in the water the entire time, his hand on the mare's neck, feeling her heartbeat through his palm. He couldn't hear her labored breathing, but he could feel the flutter of exhaustion in her pulse, the faint tremor of her muscles as they threatened to give out. He talked to her, not with his voice, but with his touch, the same steady pressure he had used with frightened animals his entire life. When the vet finally arrived and the mare was sedated enough to be moved, she was lifted from the water with her colt still pressed against her side, neither of them willing to be separated. Ruth Hendricks stood on the bank, one foal already wrapped in blankets in the triage tent, and now a second being carried up the slope. And she did the only thing she could think to do. She walked over to Mark Sutton, the man she had passed in town 100 times without a word, the deaf farmer everyone had politely ignored for 4 decades, and she wrapped her arms around him. She spoke into his shoulder, her words lost to the rain and the river, but he felt the vibration of her gratitude through his chest. He didn't need to hear the words to understand. That evening, as the rain finally began to ease and the river slowly retreated, the story started to spread. Not just the rescue, but the way it had happened. How Mark had walked into water that swallowed a grown horse, guided by nothing but sensation. How he had read the river while hearing people stood frozen on the shore. How he had found the mare when no one else believed she was alive. The video from the man's phone, grainy and incomplete, was uploaded to social media and shared thousands of times before midnight. The comments were a mix of awe and confusion. How did he do it? They asked. How did he know where to walk? How did he sense the mare when trained rescuers didn't? The answer, when it came, was simpler than anyone expected. Mark Sutton had spent his entire life learning to see what others heard. The river's roar, which had paralyzed the crowd with its overwhelming volume, had never reached his ears. He was not distracted by the noise of the disaster. He was not disoriented by the cacophony of shouting voices and surging water. While hearing people were bombarded with auditory chaos, Mark was processing a different set of inputs entirely. The vibration of the current through his boots told him the depth and speed of the water. The visual patterns on the surface revealed the hidden obstacles beneath. The tremor through the debris jam was a distress signal broadcast on a frequency only he could receive. His deafness, which the town had always viewed as a limitation, had in the crucible of the flood become something else entirely. It was a clarity that hearing people couldn't access. The next morning, the county sheriff stood in front of a cluster of reporters and said the words that no one in Clayton had ever expected to hear. Mark Sutton, he said, reading from a statement, acted with extraordinary bravery and skill. His unique abilities, honed over a lifetime, were instrumental in saving 3 equine lives yesterday. The county would like to formally recognize his heroism. He paused, glancing down at his notes as if the next part was difficult. We are also in discussions with Mr. Sutton about developing a river rescue training program utilizing his methods. It seems we have a resource in our community that we have overlooked for far too long. Mark wasn't at the press conference. He was back at the veterinary clinic, standing outside the stall where Annie lay on fresh straw, her 2 foals nursing at her side. The mare lifted her head when she saw him, and her ears swiveled forward. She didn't nicker. She didn't need to. Mark pressed his hand against her neck, feeling the steady thrum of a healthy heartbeat, and he smiled. The river had tried to take everything from her. It had failed, but the story doesn't end here. Because what the town didn't know, what even Mark's closest neighbors had never learned, was that the flood wasn't the first time his deafness had saved a life. There was another river, on another day, and a boy who had learned to read water long before anyone thought to teach him. That story, buried for 40 years, was about to surface, and it would change everything the people of Clayton thought they knew about the quiet farmer in their midst. The river that taught Mark Sutton to read water was not the McClellan. It was the Teton, 100 miles north, and he was 11 years old when he almost died in it. His family had been visiting his uncle's ranch for the summer, a rare break from the relentless labor of their own tenant farm. Mark's older brother, Daniel, was 12, and the two boys had been given a single instruction: stay away from the river. The Teton was running high that July, fed by an unusually heavy snowmelt, and the currents were treacherous even for experienced swimmers. The boys agreed, as boys do, and then immediately disobeyed. By noon on the third day, they had found a swimming hole where the river pooled behind a fallen pine, the water deep and green and irresistible. Daniel dove in first. Mark, who had already been deaf for 4 years, sat on the bank and watched the surface patterns, the way the water swirled around the submerged branches, the faint tremor of the current through the mud beneath his bare feet. Something felt wrong. He couldn't have explained what, only that the river was pulling harder than it looked. Daniel surfaced laughing, then dove again. He didn't come up. Mark saw the splash, then nothing. He saw the surface go smooth where his brother had been, and he understood with the cold clarity of a child who had already learned that the world was not safe. The fallen pine had created a hidden undertow, a spinning column of water beneath the branches that pulled downward and held its victims under. Daniel was trapped, his body pinned against the submerged trunk by the force of the current. Mark didn't scream. He couldn't hear his own voice, and had long ago stopped using it in moments of crisis. Instead, he did what his body had been training itself to do since the meningitis had stolen his hearing. He read the water. He saw where the surface bulged slightly, indicating the outline of the submerged tree. He saw where the eddy line marked the boundary between the safe water and the death zone. He saw the faint stir of bubbles rising from where his brother was trapped. He dove in, aiming not for the center of the pool, but for a narrow gap between two branches that his eyes had traced. He found Daniel's arm, wedged against the trunk, and he pulled. The current fought him, but he had positioned himself in the slack water behind the tree, using the same hydraulic forces that had trapped his brother as a shield against the river's full weight. He hauled Daniel free and dragged him to the surface. When their uncle found them an hour later, both boys were sitting on the bank, Daniel coughing water, and Mark staring at the river with an expression that was not shock, but concentration. He was still reading it. The family never spoke of it afterward. Daniel was embarrassed. Their parents were grateful, but unnerved, and Mark was simply a deaf boy who had gotten lucky. No one considered that he had done something remarkable, something that had required a kind of perception that hearing people didn't possess. His uncle, asked years later, would shrug and say, "The boy was always different. He just seemed to know things." But the town of Clayton never learned this story. Mark never told it. And so the quiet farmer who walked into the McClellan River 40 years later was seen as a sudden hero, an overnight miracle. The truth was far more unsettling. He had been a hero in waiting for 4 decades, and no one had bothered to notice. The week after the flood was a strange one in Clayton. The national media descended, then retreated, leaving behind a residue of attention that the town didn't quite know how to process. Mark Sutton's face appeared on morning shows and news websites, usually accompanied by the grainy phone footage of him wading into the brown water. Reporters called his landline, but he never answered. They showed up at his farm, but he was busy mending fences that the storm had damaged, and he communicated through Martha Camden, who had become his unofficial interpreter. She told them, in her blunt way, that Mark wasn't interested in being a celebrity, that he had a farm to run and animals to feed, and that if they wanted to understand what had happened, they should stop asking about heroism and start asking about the river. But something had shifted in Clayton itself. The people who had spent 40 years overlooking Mark Sutton now looked at him with new eyes, and what they saw made them uncomfortable. It wasn't just that he had done something brave. It was that he had done something they couldn't have done, something that required a capacity they lacked, and that capacity was directly linked to the very thing they had always pitied. His deafness, the word itself, became a problem. People stumbled over it in conversation, unsure whether to mention it or avoid it. They wanted to celebrate him, but they didn't know how to do it without acknowledging that their celebration was tangled up in decades of neglect. The sheriff's offer to develop a river rescue training program was announced in the local paper, and the response was mixed. Some thought it was an inspired idea, a way to turn Mark's unique abilities into a resource for the whole county. Others were skeptical. A deaf man training hearing rescuers? How would that even work? The skepticism was not always voiced publicly, but it was there, a low murmur of doubt that ran beneath the surface like an undertow. Mark heard none of it directly, but he felt the vibrations. He could tell when people were uncomfortable, could read the tension in their shoulders and the careful way they formed their words. He had been reading hearing people for longer than he had been reading rivers. Then Ruth Hendricks did something unexpected. She wrote a letter to the editor of the Clayton Courier, and it was published on the front page of the Sunday edition. In it, she described what she had seen from the bridge and from the bank. She described the crowd frozen in place, herself included. She described Mark walking into the water with no hesitation, guided by something she couldn't perceive. And she wrote a line that landed in Clayton like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't save my horses despite being deaf. He saved them because he was deaf. The river that sounded like chaos to us sounded like nothing to him. And in that silence, he heard what we couldn't. The letter went viral, locally, then regionally. Disability advocacy groups picked it up. A professor of audiology at the State University wrote an op-ed about sensory compensation and the neurological advantages of the deaf brain in certain emergency scenarios. The phrase deaf gain began to circulate, a term Mark had never heard but that captured something essential about his experience. The town of Clayton, which had always treated his silence as an absence, was suddenly being forced to confront the idea that it might be a presence, a different kind of perception that had value precisely because it was not like theirs. Mark found the whole thing bewildering. He had not set out to prove anything. He had seen a foal in danger and done what his body knew how to do. The idea that this was now a lesson, a program, a movement, was alien to him. But he also understood, with the same quiet clarity with which he read rivers, that something important was happening. The town had overlooked him for 40 years. Now it was trying to see him. The question was whether he wanted to be seen. He thought about this as he stood in the paddock behind his barn, watching Annie and her 2 foals graze. Ruth had asked him to keep them for a few weeks while her own fencing was repaired, and Mark had agreed without hesitation. The mare had recovered remarkably well from her ordeal, her cuts healing, her weight returning. The foals were thriving. Penny, the filly he had pulled from the sandbank, had developed a habit of following him around the paddock, her small muzzle nudging his hip whenever he stopped moving. The colt, who Ruth had named Anchor, was shyer but no less attached, and Annie herself, the big chestnut mare who had swum through a mile of floodwater with her newborn pressed against her side, would lift her head whenever Mark appeared and watch him with an expression that was almost maternal. She knew him. She remembered. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Mark received a visitor he hadn't expected. The man who pulled into his driveway in a state-issued sedan was Robert Chen, the director of emergency management for the entire region. He was not a local. He had driven 4 hours from the state capital after reading Ruth's letter and the subsequent coverage. He stepped out of his car, a tall man in his 50s with a face that had spent years looking at disaster plans, and walked directly toward Mark with a respect that needed no interpreter. He had done his homework. He knew that the state's emergency response protocols had a blind spot, a gap that nobody in the bureaucracy had fully recognized. Deaf and hard of hearing individuals were almost never recruited as first responders. Their potential advantages in certain disaster scenarios had never been studied, let alone utilized. And here, in a small town that had ignored its deaf farmer for decades, was a living demonstration of what had been missed. Chen didn't offer Mark a job. He offered him a platform. The state was prepared to fund a pilot program, housed in Clayton, that would train emergency responders in non-auditory river rescue techniques. Mark would design the curriculum. He would teach. He would be compensated at a rate that made his eyebrows rise when Martha translated it. There would be interpreters, equipment, a dedicated training facility on the bend of the McClellan where the flood had happened. The program would be named after him. Mark listened, watching Chen's lips and letting Martha's hands translate the parts he missed. When Chen finished, Mark stood quietly for a long moment, looking out over the paddock where Annie and her foals grazed in the afternoon sun. He thought about the Teton River, about his brother's arm wedged beneath the fallen pine. He thought about the 40 years he had spent as the town's invisible man, the deaf farmer who waved from his truck and kept moving. He thought about the children in Clayton who were growing up now, children who might one day face a flood or a river or an emergency that their ears couldn't navigate. And then he turned back to Chen and nodded. He didn't sign anything elaborate. He simply raised one hand, palm open, and then moved it forward. Yes, let's do it. The news of the program broke in late summer, and the reaction was beyond anything anyone in Clayton had anticipated. The story of the deaf farmer turned river rescue trainer tapped into something deep in the national psyche, a hunger for narratives of overlooked value and unexpected redemption. Mark was interviewed by a national magazine with Martha translating, and his words were printed verbatim. The river doesn't care if you can hear. It only cares if you can read it. I've spent my life learning to read what others ignore. I guess it's time to teach. But if the town thought the story was over, they were wrong. Because what Mark hadn't told anyone, what he had kept private even from Martha, was the real reason he had agreed to train others. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the recognition. It was something he had felt in the water that day, a vibration he had recognized from 40 years earlier on the Teton River. The McClellan flood hadn't been a natural disaster, at least not entirely. And what he had sensed beneath the surface was about to change everything the investigators thought they knew about why that river rose so fast. The vibration had been wrong from the moment he stepped into the water. Mark had felt it immediately, a thrumming through his boots that didn't match the rhythm of a natural flood. Flash floods rise and fall with a certain organic pattern, a swelling and retreating that follows the contours of the land and the volume of rainfall. But the McClellan River that day had surged with a mechanical suddenness, a sharp spike in pressure that felt less like weather and more like a release. He hadn't been able to place it in the chaos of the rescue. His mind focused on the foal and the current and the collapsing sandbank. But afterward, standing on the bank with Annie's heartbeat steady under his palm, the memory of that wrong vibration had settled into his consciousness like a splinter. Something had caused the river to rise faster than nature alone could explain, and he intended to find out what it was. He started with the obvious question: what was upstream? The McClellan River wound through 70 miles of canyon and farmland before it reached Clayton, passing through 2 small towns and a stretch of federal land. About 15 miles upstream, tucked into a narrow gorge, sat the Lomax Dam, a concrete gravity structure built in the 1960s to provide irrigation water for the valley. It was old but well maintained, according to the state's inspection records. Its operators were required to report any unscheduled releases. On the day of the flood, no such release had been reported. The official explanation was that an unprecedented rainfall event had overwhelmed the dam's spillway capacity, causing an uncontrolled overflow. It was an act of God, the report said. Unforeseeable, unpreventable, Mark read the report with Martha translating the technical language into sign. When she finished, he shook his head. He asked her to request the dam's operational logs for the 24 hours preceding the flood. The request was met with bureaucratic resistance, then with a polite refusal. The logs were under review, they were told. Part of an internal investigation. Mark didn't push. He simply drove his truck up the canyon road and parked at the public overlook above the dam. He got out, walked to the railing, and pressed his palm against the metal barrier. The vibration came through, the deep hum of water moving through concrete, and beneath it the subtler frequencies of machinery. He stood there for a long time, feeling the dam's pulse through his hand, and when he finally lowered his arm, his face was set. He couldn't prove what he knew, not in a way that would stand up in a court or a hearing. But he knew, with the same certainty with which he had read the river on the day of the flood, that the Lomax Dam had released water before the rainfall reached crisis levels. The surge that had stranded Penny on the sandbank, that had swept Annie and her newborn colt into the current, had not been an accident of nature. It had been a decision made by human beings who had gambled with the river and lost. The investigation that followed would take 4 months. It would involve journalists, state regulators, and eventually a legislative inquiry. It would uncover a pattern of deferred maintenance at Lomax Dam, a series of internal warnings that had been ignored, and a decision by the dam manager, a man named Gerald Hobbs, to release water preemptively without notifying downstream communities. Hobbs had been afraid that the aging spillway gates would fail during the storm, causing a catastrophic dam breach. He had made a calculation: release a manageable surge now, or risk an uncontrolled collapse later. He chose the surge. He did not pick up the phone to warn anyone. He assumed the water would rise gradually enough for people to evacuate. He was wrong. When the findings were made public, the town of Clayton erupted in fury. Gerald Hobbs was fired. The dam's operating company was fined $2.7 million, a sum that sounded enormous, but that translated to roughly 2 years of profit for the corporation that owned it. The state promised reforms, new notification systems, mandatory downstream warnings. But for Mark, the vindication was not in the penalties or the promises. It was in the quiet acknowledgement that his perception had been right. The river had spoken to him, and he had listened, and what it had said was true. The training program launched in the spring, housed in a converted barn on the edge of the McClellan River. less than 100 yards from where the sandbank had collapsed. The facility was modest but functional. A classroom with visual teaching aids, a dock that extended into the river, and a series of training pools where recruits could learn to read currents in controlled conditions. The curriculum was unlike anything that existed in the standard emergency response literature. Mark taught his students to feel water rather than hear it. He had them stand in the shallows with their eyes closed, learning to distinguish the vibration of a deep channel from the tremor of a submerged obstacle. He taught them to watch surface patterns, to read the language of eddies and boils and seams that revealed what lay beneath. He taught them that silence was not emptiness, but a different kind of attention, a focus that hearing people rarely achieved because they were too distracted by noise. The first cohort of trainees was small, just 12 people. They were firefighters and paramedics, search and rescue volunteers, a couple of park rangers from the National Forest. None of them were deaf. That came later. By the second year, Mark had insisted on recruiting trainees from the deaf community, arguing that people who had spent their lives navigating a hearing world had already developed the perceptual skills that hearing rescuers were struggling to learn. The state resisted at first, citing liability concerns and communication barriers. Mark's response was simple. He asked the state officials to stand in the river with their eyes closed and tell him what they felt. None of them could do it. They couldn't even stay upright in the current without their ears to orient them. The resistance crumbled. The program began actively recruiting deaf and hard of hearing candidates, and within 3 years it had trained more than 80 certified river rescue specialists, nearly a third of whom were deaf. The impact rippled outward in ways that no one had predicted. The deaf trainees who went through the program became advocates in their own communities, pushing for inclusion in emergency response systems that had long ignored them. A deaf firefighter in Oregon, who had flown to Clayton for the training, adapted the techniques for her own department and saved a family of 4 from a flash flood the following winter. A hard-of-hearing park ranger in Montana used Mark's current reading methods to locate a missing hiker who had fallen into a river and been swept downstream. The stories accumulated, each one a small proof of concept, until the program was no longer an experiment, but a model. But the most significant change happened in Clayton itself. The town that had overlooked Mark Sutton for 40 years now saw him everywhere. His face was on the sign outside the training center. His methods were taught in the local high school's outdoor education class. Children who had grown up watching their parents ignore the quiet farmer now learned to sign his name. The transformation was not complete, and it was not without its awkward moments. There were still people who didn't know how to talk to him, who defaulted to pity or discomfort when they remembered he couldn't hear. But those people were shrinking in number, replaced by a generation that had grown up with a different story about what deafness meant. Ruth Hendricks became one of Mark's closest collaborators. After the flood, she had thrown herself into learning American Sign Language, driven by a gratitude that she couldn't fully express in spoken words. Within a year, she was fluent enough to serve as a backup interpreter when Martha was unavailable. She also became the training program's administrative director, handling the logistics and the paperwork and the endless grant applications that kept the center funded. Her mare, Annie, and the 2 foals became the program's unofficial mascots, grazing in a paddock beside the training center where recruits could see them every day. Penny, the filly Mark had pulled from the sandbank, grew into a striking chestnut mare who would walk directly to Mark whenever he entered the paddock, pressing her muzzle against his chest in a greeting that needed no translation. One afternoon, about 4 years after the flood, a bus pulled up to the training center carrying a group of children from the state school for the deaf. They were between 8 and 12 years old, a mix of boys and girls, and they spilled out of the bus with the chaotic energy of any field trip. But there was something different in their faces when they saw Mark walking toward them, his hands already moving in greeting. They were seeing something they rarely encountered in the world. A deaf adult in a position of authority and respect. A man whose deafness was not a footnote, but a foundation. Mark led them to the river's edge, and he taught them to feel the water through their feet. He showed them how the surface patterns revealed the hidden depths. He told them, through an interpreter, the story of what had happened on this river, not because he wanted to impress them, but because he wanted them to understand something essential. The world would tell them, in 1,000 subtle ways, that their deafness was a deficit. The river told a different story. The river didn't care if you could hear. It only cared if you could pay attention. The children stood in the shallows, their shoes off, their faces tight with concentration. One by one, their expressions shifted. They began to feel it, the subtle thrum of the current, the vibration of water moving over stone. A girl with braids and a bright pink hearing aid looked up at Mark and signed a single word, "I feel it." Mark nodded. Of course she did. She had been training for this her whole life without knowing it. That evening, after the children had left and the training center had gone quiet, Mark walked down to the paddock where Annie and her daughters grazed. Penny came to him immediately, as she always did. Anchor, the colt who had been shielded by his mother's body in the debris jam, was now a solid gelding with his dam's calm temperament. And Annie herself, the mare who should have died a dozen times over, lifted her head and watched Mark approach with the same steady gaze she had fixed on him from the stall in the veterinary clinic. He pressed his hand against her neck, feeling the familiar rhythm of her pulse. The sun was setting over the McClellan River, painting the water in shades of gold and copper. It was the same river that had tried to kill them all, and it was still running, still carrying its secrets downstream. But it was no longer the enemy. It was a teacher, and it had found its student. The final chapter of Mark's story did not come from the river. It came from the town. In the spring of the 5th year after the flood, the Clayton County Council voted to rename the bridge where the crowd had stood frozen. It had been called the Mill Road Bridge for a century, a name that meant nothing and remembered no one. The council proposed a new name, the Sutton Crossing. The vote was unanimous. At the dedication ceremony, a crowd gathered that was larger than any the town had seen since the flood itself. Reporters came. State officials came. Robert Chen, now the deputy director of the state's emergency management agency, gave a speech that lasted 12 minutes. But it was Mark who spoke last. He stood at the railing of the bridge, the same railing he had leaned over to look down at a dying foal 5 years earlier, and he addressed the crowd in American Sign Language, with Martha translating aloud. His hands moved with the precision of a man who had spent his life communicating in a language that required physical intention. He told them that he had not set out to be a hero. He had simply seen something that needed doing and done it. He told them that the river had been his teacher long before it became his stage. And he told them that he forgave the town for the 40 years of silence, not because it hadn't mattered, but because holding on to it would have been a different kind of drowning. Then he said one more thing, something that nobody in the crowd had expected. He said that Gerald Hobbs, the dam manager who had caused the flood, had written him a letter from prison. Hobbs was serving an 18-month sentence for criminal negligence, and in his letter he had asked for Mark's forgiveness. Mark had written back. He had told Hobbs that the river didn't hold grudges, and neither would he. The crowd was silent for a long moment after Martha translated those words. Then someone began to clap, and the sound spread until it filled the valley. Mark couldn't hear it, but he could feel it, the vibration of hundreds of hands coming together, traveling up through the wooden bridge and into his feet. He stood there, a deaf man on a bridge named after him, and he felt the applause of the town that had finally learned to see him. 5 years after the flood, Mark Sutton still wakes before dawn to feed his animals. He still walks the banks of the McClellan River, his hand brushing the surface, reading the water in a language that no hearing person has ever learned. The training center runs without him now, staffed by graduates who have become teachers in their own right. The program has expanded to 3 other states, each one adapting his methods to their own rivers and their own disasters. And somewhere in the archives of the State Emergency Management Agency, there is a document filed under Best Practices that begins with a single sentence. The most effective river rescuer we have ever trained cannot hear the river at all. The town of Clayton has changed, too. The Sutton Crossing Bridge carries traffic every day, and the children who cross it on their way to school know the story. They know about the deaf farmer who walked into the flood when no one else would move. They know about the mare who shielded her newborn through a mile of debris. They know that the quiet man on the back roads was never quiet at all. He was just speaking in a different frequency. And that is perhaps the deepest lesson of this story. Not that Mark Sutton was a hero, though he was. Not that the town learned to appreciate him, though it did. The deepest lesson is that we have organized our world around a single way of perceiving it, and in doing so, we have missed entire categories of value. We have built emergency systems that rely on sirens and shouted warnings, excluding millions of people who could contribute in ways we cannot yet imagine. We have treated disability as absence, when it is often a different kind of presence, a shift in attention that opens up capacities the rest of us have allowed to atrophy. Mark does not say this in so many words. He is not a philosopher or an activist. He is a farmer who knows how to read rivers because he had no choice but to learn. But his life makes the argument for him. Every rescue performed by a graduate of his program is a rebuttal to the assumption that disability is disqualification. Every deaf child who stood in the shallows and felt the current for the first time is a living proof that what the world calls a deficit can, in the right context, be a gift. The mare, Annie, lived to be 22 years old. She spent her final years grazing in the paddock beside the training center, her 2 foals grown and grazing beside her. Penny became a therapy horse, visiting schools and hospitals with Ruth Hendricks, who had become a certified equine therapist. Anchor became a search and rescue horse, trained to navigate floodwaters with a deaf handler who had learned Mark's methods. And Annie herself, the chestnut mare who should have drowned on that spring afternoon, died peacefully in her stall with Mark's hand on her neck, his palm reading the slowing rhythm of her heart until the very last beat. If you ask Mark today what he is most proud of, he will not mention the bridge or the training center or the awards that sit on a shelf in his farmhouse. He will tell you that he is proud of the fact that he was there, that when the moment came, he did not freeze. He will tell you that the river speaks to anyone who is willing to listen, and that listening has nothing to do with ears. Before we leave you, we want to ask you something. Think about the people in your own community who have been overlooked, whose abilities have been dismissed because they do not fit the standard mold. What might they be capable of if someone simply gave them the chance? If this story has moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another. And in the comments, tell us where in the world you are watching from and share a story about someone whose hidden strength changed everything. The world is full of Mark Suttons. It is time we learn to see them.